Today's discussion is going to be on Religionswissenschaft, or the science of religion. More accurately, and how we would say it in the common parlance, is what is religious studies? What makes the discipline of religion a unique discipline as opposed to just a piece or a part of other disciplines? Or is it an umbrella that other disciplines might find themselves underneath it? Importantly, for a lot of you too, might be the question of how is it you approach religion? Is it just the product of something else, or is it its own unique thing that then structures others? With this will be a little bit of the discussion too on different definitions of religion.
For some, to help answer the question of what is a religion, they might look at the academic discipline, which is dedicated to the idea of religion itself, religious studies. It's emerged from the Germanic discipline of Religionswissenschaft, the science of religion. It's an academic discipline that tries to analyze what is a religion and what counts. But it has a lot of overlap with other discussions. We've already hinted at economics with Marx and Weber. We can look at philosophy. We can look at psychology. Or we can look at traditions specifically and identify these as the basis of that. Or you can look at it from a sociologist or anthropologist perspective. Or you can look at it from other specialist sort of perspectives and ways people have of structuring their lives. In many ways, religious studies has kind of always existed whenever people are talking about at least their discipline, their study of what matters the most, if we're going to borrow some language here from Paul Tillich. Medieval advanced degrees were doctorates in theology, philosophy, and finally medicine in that order. And theology was trying to figure out this religion question, but not necessarily in the broad answer. Not analyzing it as opposed to one versus another, but understanding the intricacies of a single tradition. The basic liberal arts education kind of grew out of this, into the classical period where we had the sort of 7 disciplines, the quadrivium and the trivium, where this would be your basic degree, and yet religion wasn't there. We have arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy in the quadrivium, and grammar, logic, and rhetoric in the trivium. And other sciences kind of all grow out of different discussions within all of these. Disciplines, terms, and definitions grow and change over time as well. Most of us approach one idea a lot differently than they would have 500 or 1,000 or 3,000 years ago, even if the same word exists, because words evolve and change. New elements get brought in. Comparisons arise. And so what is religious studies is kind of that discipline that emerged mid-19th century or so to try to address all of this, and not everyone has the same answer. Different scholars have different views as to what a definition of a religion should be. Catherine Bell ends up defining religion as relating to the sense of reality beyond the day-to-day, while Martin Marty addresses notions of ultimate concern, borrowing language from Tillich. Myths, symbols, rites, ceremonies, behaviors, and corollaries, a belief in a world that's beyond this one, but also includes elements of community. Claude Lévi-Strauss talks about religion as a structure. It's one of these key structures of society as a structuralist. He analyzes these in this way. J.Z. Smith is an anthropologist of religion, and we'll talk more about him as a historical anthropologist of religion and how he defines that at the end of the semester. Now, these are 4 fairly recent, eminent scholars that don't all have the same agreement as to what is a religion.
There are different schools of thought when it comes to religious studies, usually coming out of either a nation, such as England or France, or from different universities. In the United States, we have 2 sort of strands of schools, one originating kind of out of Harvard and that the systems that they create there,
The other one that I was trained in much more is the University of Chicago School of Religious Studies. For them, there are 4 dominant scholars that kind of comprise different aspects of what we look at with religion. We have Marx, Weber, who we've talked about already, and we also have Durkheim and Freud. Durkheim's definition of religion is that it's a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite into a single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. Of course, Durkheim's definition is a little broad, and it has a lot of these aspects that we would want to define a religion. It's got beliefs, but not just beliefs, also practices, actions that are done. It's relative to sacred things. There's something that's a lot more important. Either you have to avoid it or be drawn closer to it, right? Set apart and forbidden. And there's an idea of a community of people here. And many scholars really like Durkheim's definition of religion. There is a problem with Durkheim's definition of religion, though, that it might apply as much to a football team, Elks Club, Rotary Club, social club of any sorts as it does to a religion, right? They have certain taboos on sports and what you're allowed to do and not do during certain times. Cutting your hair, shaving, eating different foods, right? The different fetishes and all of these other things that apply within basic sports life or community life, that there's certain times when things are okay and not, that we wouldn't necessarily identify as a religion. And so Durkheim's definition checks a lot of our boxes, but might be so inclusive that it includes some things that we don't like. Freud argues that religion consists of certain dogmas and assertions about facts and conditions of external or internal reality, which tells you something that does not have, that you haven't discovered on your own, and that it gives credence to that claim. And so you're taking these beliefs and dogmas that somebody else has done, and it helps to make meaning to your life. And Freud adds the meaningfulness to this debate that maybe Durkheim didn't include, but yet doesn't always have the objects of the value that Durkheim has addressed. Again, we've addressed Marx and Weber and Durkheim and Freud, and what a religion is might be some sort of amalgamation or part of each of these men, and maybe none of their definitions is complete or good enough, but might have elements of what we might think works for a definition of a religion. One person whose definition of religion has gained ground in the last 30 or 40 years is Clifford Geertz. Geertz has got a fairly long definition of religion, but it addresses many of these boxes that we probably want to say a religion is. Geertz defines religion as a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivation in men and women by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Here we see some of the elements of Durkheim, some of the elements of Freud, some of the elements of Marx and Weber as well, but adds to that. We're talking about moods and motivations. We've got a moral community wrapped up in with all this, and yet there's something extra that Geertz adds by first addressing religion as a system of symbols and the value that symbols have for us.
So, what is religion? The short answer to the question is that the word religion has more than one meaning. One is the contemporary, colloquial, everyday sense. When we talk about religions, we refer to cultural traditions that we're familiar with, that we all just kind of look at and go, yeah, that's a religion. In saying this, however, we are not offering a definition of religion. We're just pointing out how the word is typically used. And this, of course, is difficult because we want to actually define our terms so we understand how this is going. We can't formulate an official definition that also fits with our colloquial use. There are certain pieces that look like they should fit, but don't when we actually give a specific definition. Each definition appears to be either so broad that it's practically useless, or else it's rather small and excludes things that the contemporary colloquial everyday use typically includes. This is okay, for the record. Words have meanings, and these meanings sometimes do not properly include the particulars for which the reasons and the context of those words change. Uh, but it's important to understand at least some notion of where we're starting from, and the colloquial everyday use is important, but it might not also be accurate. You might want to say it's wrong.
When defining religion, it's also important to know certain terms that they might add to and change how you'd want to understand what is a religion or not. It's the language that's important to know what you're supposed to do going forward. One term that you probably are a little bit familiar with is the notion of a worldview. Literally, it's just how you see the world and its makeup and your relation of different people to one another and in that world. Is your world filled with scientific reality, magic, witchcraft? Is there an answer for everything, or are some things without answers? Is the world flat? Is it round? Is gravity a constant? Are there certain things that are sacred and certain things that are not? What is it you and your culture prize? Liberty, security, freedom? Right? Different worldviews, different people would have different answers to some of these questions. Is there a caste system? How many times have you been here before? Is this your only life, or are you going to live over and over again? Very important for a lot of discussions, especially in the West of religion, is notions of doxa, orthodox, right belief, or right teachings, straight teachings, ortho literally meaning straight. Right? Are the teachings correct? Is this really the important idea within the religion, or do you as a religion care a lot more about praxis, about actions? Western Christianity, especially in relation to the Protestant Reformation, has really stressed the notion of doxa. Earlier Christianity, doxa was formulated in creeds, and it defined what Christianity was. But otherwise, it spent most of its history dealing with praxis. What actions are you going to do to live a holy life? You're going to check the boxes of your beliefs, and then there's councils and creeds that will identify that. But other than that, it's about how you're going to live your life. Within Islam, it's about the 5 pillars. It's what things you must do will help define what your religion is. Now, doxa can't be ignored, but your praxis is important. Within Hinduism, it's all about your dharma, your duty. And that's, again, about your praxis. They have these sort of distinctions about what beliefs as opposed to what actions you need to do within different religions that you might say brings one closer or farther away from your category of what religion should be. Heterodox would be those questionable beliefs, and we can even talk about heteroprax, of questionable actions, of whether or not they'll be of any benefit to you. But heterodox are those sorts of things of the, well, maybe it's okay for you to believe that, maybe it's not. And who's going to help define and explain that kind of moves through within, depending on who's got the authority to do so. Heresy are unacceptable beliefs, things that are outside of what's there. Sometimes there's an ecclesial structure that dictates this. There's a high priest or a bishop, or sometimes there's a council or a creed which will define what heresy is. Sometimes it's just because it goes against the basic notions and teachings of what's assumed to be the case. There are 2 great 5th century BC Hindu heresies, Jainism and Buddhism. Now, there wasn't an ecclesial structure that banished these out and said you're heretics, but they rejected caste. Therefore, they're seen as heresies. That how they're going to formulate their worldview is not acceptable. If they accepted that, they'd just be a different branch of heterodox teachings on what it is to be a Hindu in all likelihood to this day. Doctrine are these formal systemized statements of beliefs or these explicit teachings which help define what is that doxa and what is okay and what's not okay and where the debate should lie. Diaspora, we talk about people who live outside of their naturally linked Holy Land. Not every religion, again, depending on how you want to define this term, has a naturally linked Holy Land, a place where you really belong, that you may or may not actually ever want to go to. You may never have been. But there's this idea that your religious home, your spiritual home is in this place, in Judea, in India. It's along this river. It's over there, right? You don't have this within all religious traditions, primarily only within Judaism and within Hinduism. But again, not everyone who's living in diaspora doesn't want to live in diaspora. There is also discussions of diaspora now under ethnic connections and cultural identities. But originally, when this term was being used, it's about the religious identity, and this is what it's meaning. An ascetic is usually that praxis that's going to be done to help elevate you through your religious struggles. It's doing without. Oftentimes it's food or various other pleasures. It's things that are okay for you to do normally, but not okay for you to do for a prescribed period of time or for your life because you're set apart within this. Certain foods that are not okay for you to eat, or certain things that you might not want to engage in that are otherwise perfectly okay. It's not a moral issue, but it's done out of a religious purpose. And sometimes it might look the same as somebody who's doing that same action without the moral purpose, right? You're dieting, so you're avoiding this food. Well, you're not an ascetic because it doesn't have this moral or religious component added to it. Myths are also stories that are told that help convey a deep truth. We have this connotation in modern society that a myth is a falsity, but that's not what the term really means. It's rather a story that is to tell you some greater truth than maybe not even about its own truth claim. Maybe it's something broader. Maybe the story isn't true and everyone knows it's not true, or shouldn't be interpreted in his way of being literally true, but it gives us a greater meaning of who you are and what your place is in the universe. And rituals, we've talked about this a little bit already, but it's the acting out of stories, patterns, or actions where you're going to get some sort of feelings of reinforcement and connection with a group that may be large or may be small. So these are some other terms that we should know what they mean when constructing our own definition of religion. Some of you might want to weight doxa higher. Some of you might want to weight praxis higher. Some of you might not want to look at either of these and might look at just ritual and that this defines it. Now, what makes one ritual okay versus not? Is that how it's performed or why it's performed, or is another debate that exists amongst different people. Also just wanted to add a couple of quick notes as far as discussions of religion and how people talk about it. First, I want to point out that every culture has its own calendar. 2015 is the year 2015 for some, but is 5775, 1436, 547, 2071, depending on different religious groups that have different calendars that have a different date for starting it. Additionally, for some, they're going to have discussions of changing the calendar of what we have from AD and BC to CE and BCE. For those of you unfamiliar with these letters and what they all stand for, that's perfectly fine. But AD stands for Anno Domini, or Year of our Lord? Well, there was a thought amongst some that not everyone's under this Christian persuasion, and this is the Lord that's being talked about, so instead let's talk about it under the Common Era and use the letters CE. And BC, for before Christ, is changed to before the Common Era. And for some, this is a great way of kind of avoiding the religious calendar system when talking about religion broadly. I personally find the idea to be silly, since every religion has its calendar. Every culture has a calendar that they've adopted. Unless you're changing the dates in a radical way and having a specific date for a specific meaning, then you're just changing the window covering on something because you think it's going to be more pleasant to an outsider who generally doesn't care. You're not using theirs because they have their own date anyways. Right? So, again, even in how we're looking and shaping our year has different religious connotations if we intend it or not, and what values we have to look at that. Furthermore, we have discussions on even when the new year starts. Do we want to say that New Year starts September 1st following that calendar set up by Julius Caesar, the Julian calendar? September is the first year. For some of you, depending on your church calendar, this is actually the first day of the ecclesial calendar. It was modified by Pope Gregory, and we have the Gregorian calendar, which most of us live by, which changed the date of when New Year's was and put it instead in January. We also have other religious calendars that might look different. Rosh Hashanah for Judaism, usually in the fall. April 1st for many of the Germanic people were fools for not adopting the new calendar where New Year's was switched from April to January. And we've got different sort of relations on even how we're dating a year. Do we have a solar calendar or a lunar calendar? How far do things adjust versus not? And again, how we're going to order and structure our lives are tied in with religious development. And maybe you look at things historically and scientifically to try to understand what's taken as common sense, but might have extra value hidden beneath it.
There are different ways of studying religion. There are different perspectives that we can take when trying to do this, and what something counts as a religion versus doesn't. The first way that a lot of people just by default address religion is the "my way is true" approach. In this view, studying religion might amount to looking into what it is that you believe to be true, as my thing is true and the rest of the stuff is false, and the closer it is to mine, the more it is a religion, and the farther away it is, then the less it counts. And that's one way of approaching, and a lot of us kind of just do this by default because we start from the subjective, and there's nothing wrong with that. We just need to recognize that that might be the case, and as an academic looking into this, we probably should stretch beyond this, or at least know why we would say what we would say. The second common way people tend to think about religion is just a belief system. On this view, religious practitioners subscribe to a system of beliefs, and the beliefs they hold inform and shape their behavior. The problem with this is that most people do things and don't just believe things. They also don't believe in systems. They have incorporated a system and usually debate particulars or even believe things that contradict themselves. The problem with this approach is that we don't really work this way. We might think that we work this way and I have these beliefs, but we do things all the time that surprise us about ourselves, about what it is we really believe, and our own convictions get challenged when we actually do something that's different. The third way of studying religion is by looking at what a religion does. What does the religion say that it does? And then what does it do? Does a religion say these are important aspects and therefore we all do these things? It's not just about a belief, but it's about what happens. When do people show up? Do they show up to a particular building or a sacred grove or a river or somebody's house? And how often? And what do they expect when they show up there? What rituals are lived out in this way? So we're not necessarily understanding what people are believing, but we're seeing what they're doing. Again, the problem with this is that it's kind of sterile sometimes. You're looking at people and checking a list instead of saying, well, what it really means for these people is probably somewhere between all three of these that we've discussed. And yet, that's where meaning is to be found. One way a lot of scholars look at religion is from the function. What does it do? Functionalism is relatively straightforward. Scholars who use this approach look for a particular function that this religion might play in society. Functionalism does not care if it is right or wrong, but rather wonders at what is actually being accomplished. Functionalists also often use an organic analogy to explain why societies do what they do. Each act fulfills a specific function, just like the different parts of the body perform a different function. Societies provide these through different aspects of what they have, what its makeup is, what its constituent parts are. It's to help the organism live and thrive. Functionalists will look at what needs are being met by a religious institution or belief or practice. And these include psychological and instrumental needs. Three psychological needs that are usually discussed are nutrition, reproduction, and shelter, or bodily comfort and relaxation is usually wrapped up with this notion of shelter, right? What is that basic sort of things that we need to know that we are healthy and can go forward? Other instrumental needs might be things like economics, notions of growth, social control, which discusses safety and security, political organizations, and basic education, right? If these needs are not being met, people generally don't survive. And so, what do you do? Well, some functionalists will say religion helps fill in some of these needs. It is able to help you stay safe when the world around you isn't safe, or something along these lines. Culture is about providing these needs for the individual within that environment. The problem with functionalism is that it might look at parts rather than really a living thing. It's an autopsy, not a checkup. What happens when you dissect something is you might be able to weigh the size of the liver, but that thing isn't going to be alive anymore. Dissection inevitably kills it. So if you're looking at a particular act within a ritual, you're kind of decontextualizing that ritual, and in some ways you're killing its larger meaning because it's really about an interconnectedness that exists within there. Yet there are a lot of different scholars who fit into a functionalist camp, or at least begin there, and they might move on from that. One example is Sigmund Freud. Freud's theory of religion is a perfect example of the functionalist approach. Freud argued in his work The Future of an Illusion that all humans have desires or instincts that need to be repressed by society if a society is to function. Freud believed that religion provides these illusions that offer the sort of compensation or relief that is required. He then went on to argue that a religion like Christianity provides this psychological compensation through the creation of the illusion that adherents will then go off to heaven, that human suffering in this life will be directly tied to a promise that you won't have to have that when you die. So, why does religion exist for Freud? The answer is simple, because something is necessary to alleviate the friction created by social repression. Religion in a society is like the oil in an engine that keeps it from overheating. Now, again, Freud called these things illusions. He didn't believe that these things were true, but yet it's a useful tool for a society to advance this, at least a society he would say that was before his, or people who couldn't hold on to his notion of what a religion was. Another scholar's approach of functionalism is Bronislaw Malinowski. He tells us that not all stories are myths, and myths are more than just stories themselves. They supply us with a foundational understanding of how society is to operate. Myths are the sign or the blueprint of how a society is supposed to move forward. They are also civilization's ways of providing the psychological needs for individuals. He states, the function of magic is to ritualize man's optimism, to enhance his faith in the victory, his hope over his fear. I. M. Lewis, primarily in his work Ecstatic Religion, but in a few others as well, states that the aim and scope of religion is all of society. This is evident through the myriads of functions that peripheral cults and spirit possession addresses. Peripheral cults, he tells us, serve to give us a voice to the marginalized as a protest. They also serve to separate one group from another and can be used to enforce morality, to be a focal point for the larger society and bringing these disparate groups together. Essentially, it gives voice to people who are on the outside, so that way when their needs are not being met, they aren't completely cast out and society doesn't run into a difficulty of, do we cast you out as well? Spirit possession is therefore normative within a society. It always occurs within socially acceptable schema, right? And it unites the spiritual realm with the social one. Spirit possession does something, and it's recognized as such. Scholars make a distinction between the view religious practitioners have of themselves, that of the insiders or the emic view, and the view scholars will have of them, the outsiders or edic view. Different perspectives about what a religion is sometimes help us to understand what is happening, and sometimes it doesn't. This is the difficulty with looking at anything from an outsider's perspective, is sometimes it'll give voice to what's happening on the inside, sometimes it's completely off of base. The outsider might see something that the insiders are completely unaware of, mainly because it's just something that they do. They don't understand a function that an action might have. It's taken for granted, so there's no reason to describe what it is or to give voice to this until somebody else stops and goes, what the heck is that thing and why is it you're doing it? The outsiders may also be completely off base, though, and they're saying this is why people are doing that. Similarly, someone who's an insider might not fully understand what's being done by a particular ritual or religious act. Sometimes you might even be a part of a religious tradition that does something all the time and you don't know why. And you might talk to a scholar inside your religion. You might talk to a religious leader and go, why is it we do this? And they might know, and they might also go, I don't know. Let's keep kicking it up the chain of command and figure out why it is we're doing this. Sometimes these two overlap. And when that happens, that's usually the strongest case in understanding. Not always, though. Oftentimes the perspectives are at odds as much as they do help reinforce one another. To put it in other words, in many cases, an insider's view and an outsider functionalist's explanation could both be true at the same time, though. Even if the practitioner's explanations were true, the functionalist explanation of what's going on may also be true. There might be more layers of meaning than just the one from the inside or the outside. So, why is it we do what we do? We sometimes need an outsider to help highlight this for us because oftentimes we just are doing it. We don't stop and analyze it. We just kind of take it for granted because it's been taken for granted. For instance, in American culture, generally speaking, the men do the barbecuing and the cooking outside. More men do this than women. Again, there's always exceptions. Some households this will be different. Generally speaking, no one's enforcing this or saying it has to be this way. But if you were to ask, why is it that this is the case? We don't know. You might come up with some basic reasons or something along these lines, but the eventual answer is because it's how we do things. There's no inherent reason why it is done. It's just a part of the construction of society that we have, that men become responsible for cooking outside, just like women might be responsible for cooking it inside. Again, many households this isn't the case, and the exceptions are probably as existent as the rule is as well. But it's just what we do, or at least what we see as normal or normative. Why is it that soccer, for instance, is so popular around the world, but not in the United States? Sporting KC has a good sized crowd, but it's not Wembley Stadium. Right? Kansas City is able to put together large crowds when it needs to. Look at what they do for the Chiefs games. So it's not that the city doesn't like sports, but this sport is a little less so. The answer is, again, it's just what's normal, and it seems right. Just like every time an American might see people playing cricket, we think of it as a bad version of baseball and are thoroughly confused about how they play it. And yet there are people who love it and have pickup games and play it all the time because they grow up with it and they expect it. Pierre Bourdieu, in his work Outline of a Theory of a Practice, ends up advancing one sort of means on how we see and understand this. He talks about a habitus, or the structuring structures of a society. It is a collective unfolding of society without being controlled by individuals. It seeks to replicate itself through shaping the participants' understanding of the world and what appears natural and acceptable to them. Attitudes, actions, behaviors, and beliefs become impulsive, occupying the totality of the individual and group rather than the expressive of a particular mood or motivation of a single person. In doing so, the habitus sets limits on the doxa, or the realm of what's acceptable, the teachings and practices for the group. These are not the creations of individuals, although individuals participate in the unfolding of various doxa, either enforcing them or challenging them. The result is the growth and change of a habitus slowly. He defines a habitus as the system of durable, transportable dispositions, structured structures predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, as principles which generate and organize practices and representations that can be objectively adapted to their outcomes without presupposing a conscious aiming at ends or an express mastery of the operations necessary in order to attain them, objectively regulated and regular without being in any way the product of obedience to rules. They can be collectively orchestrated without being the product of the organizing action of a conductor. These structures are given a sort of type to produce the habitus. Again, this is a structuring structure. It builds up other things. It's just how things are done and why. These structures have a tendency to replicate themselves because they're stable, they work. Right? You might reject an idea because it's not how you do things. For instance, any proclamation to a class of people in America or elsewhere that they should just simply undress would be rejected out of hand by nearly everyone because it's not appropriate. Right? What clothes we wear or even that we wear clothes is not something natural, but created by norms and practices that you rid yourself of your clothes, you would feel naked. You would feel it. It wouldn't be normal. These change as cultures change as well. It's typically a gradual process, as the process itself is resistant to change. For instance, nearly every culture around the world, women cover their head. Even in our culture, but generally not anymore outside of particular religious services is this done. For a lot of women, taking off a head covering, they would feel naked because it's not how things are done, right? It's just naturally kind of there without the system or rules are needed to enforce it. If I were to say that we should all fight each other or kill a fellow student, the same would apply. Conflict is natural, but the learned behaviors have told us that we should not simply attack someone in class, either for the benefit of the conflict itself or whatever material gain you'd get through that assault. Habitus is thus history turned into nature. There's also the problem that people believe history is inevitable, that what occurred in the past had to happen and could not have happened in any other way. Nixon is an extremely important example. He was a very popular president. He ended the Vietnam War. He tried to reform healthcare, civil rights, and the welfare in his first term. He won his election to his second term with all but 15 electoral votes. He won every state against McGovern except Massachusetts and Washington, D.C., and was voted by 60.7% of the population. But modern ideas of Nixon are only viewed through the whole Watergate scandal and the lens that we have within all of that, and usually even go back earlier to his televised debate with JFK, which, by the way, the notion of Camelot came about much later, and he lost the vote against Nixon if we exclude the dead voting in Illinois. But then again, Nixon probably had at least portions of the South that's kind of reported the dead voted there for him too. Right? Habitus is the normalized experience of doxa, of what we normally feel and understand. So certain people are seen as heroes, certain people seen as villains, certain things seen as natural, and other things rejected because it's just not how we do things. It goes without saying because it came without saying, is another way we can kind of frame what a habitus is. In his work, Varieties of Religious Experience, William James tells us that the material of our study is human nature. This includes religion, which he describes as coming from the realm of feeling. Quote, summing up in the broadest possible way the characteristics of the religious life as we have found them, it includes the following beliefs. There are 3 beliefs in which he lists. The first is that the visible world is a part of a more spiritual universe, from which it draws its chief significance. The second is that that union or harmonious relation with that higher universe is our true end. And third, that prayer or inner communion with the spirit thereof, to be the spirit of God or law, is a process wherein the work is really done, and a spiritual energy flows in and produces effects, psychological or material, within the phenomenal world. The psychological characteristics are a new zest, which adds to itself the gift of life and takes it the form of either lyrical enchantment or an appeal to earnestness and heroism. And also the second effect or characteristic of the psychological effects here is the assurance of safety and a temper of peace in relation to others as a preponderance of loving affection. Religion is founded in feeling for William James, as he tells us that individuality is founded in feeling. Who you are is based in your feeling, in your relation to your telos, the union to the higher end, the invisible world that exists alongside the visible world, and the relation and that interconnection between that, then psychologically gifted through this new zest and assurance of safety, both what lets you move forward and keeps you secure in who your identity is. Within religion, this feeling for James, he says, we can identify as faith. It is psychological because it gives us meaning, which is essential for humans to survive. And because it's also essential for our survival, it is biological as well. On one level, he says, faith is the union between our understanding and also what lies beyond our conscious mind. James asserts that there is a visible world and an invisible world. There is both matter and there is also a psychological aspect that we connect with this invisible world through. As such, God is, for William James, pragmatically a given. It is a real thing. He says, while this may be the further reaches of ourselves, it is more accurately God, a God who lives outside of individuals and produces real effects in the lives of all people. As God affects all and all people have some basis of feeling of the divine religion, it therefore is universal. God is a universal mind who is immortal with our immortal soul, gives us meaning and hope. James continues to state that this thoroughly pragmatic view of religion has usually been taken as a matter of course by common men. Again, James is one of our fathers of pragmatism, and therefore this given nature that we all just accept God as true makes it true. It gives it a body as well as a soul. It makes it a claim, as everything real must claim some characteristics realm of fact as its very own, that the more characteristically divine facts are apart from the actual inflow of energy and the faith state and the prayer state, I know not. So he says here he doesn't exactly know how all of this works, but that there is these different states of being in relation to that which is outside and above and also gives purpose, this telos that we have. But the other belief on which I'm ready to make my personal venture is that they do exist, he states. This is not just a psychological placebo or effect or something that is needed, as people like Freud would say, an illusion that is necessary to keep society together. Because of these real effects done, James asserts that this is real. Continuing on, he states, the whole drift of my education goes to persuade me that the world of our present consciousness is only one out of many worlds of consciousness that exist, and that those other worlds must contain experiences which have meaning for our lives also. So there's a world beyond just who we are, and those things produce real effects in our own lives. Friedrich Schleiermacher famously connects the notions of feeling and religion. He defines religion as the feeling of absolute dependence upon God. He tells us that religion is not found in thinking or even in acting. It is neither orthodoxy nor orthopraxy, but it is in this intuition and Gefühl, right? This feeling. Aktion and Gefühl are the German words that he ends up using. Knowledge and activity focus on the universe through an object. If the object seeks to draw you in, then it is due to feeling and intuition. If the object of knowledge does not draw you in, it remains on the outside, and therefore it is not important. Feeling draws you in and also, therefore, makes you act. It does things. Knowledge by itself does not do this. Right? We can all think of things that we know, but it's just trivia. It's just information that doesn't actually make us go and do. It's still in that way really outside of ourselves. We're not acting. It's not essential to our being, nor is it motivational. Religion is found in this deeper consideration of a thing. Quote, your feeling is piety insofar as it expresses in the matter described the being and life common to you and to the all.
Your feeling is piety insofar as it is the result of the operation of God in you by means of the operation of the world upon you. Feeling is also reflexive. You can feel yourself and think about your own feelings. In fact, this is what a lot of our life is this reflexive thought process going on where we do something, then we remember that and we remember our feelings about that thing, and then that changes how we're going to move forward within our life. You might have taken a fall on something and you're just constantly remember, okay, if I do that, that's dangerous, until you've done it again and you're like, all right, I've succeeded. This is not as scary. Why? Because you've relived it and you've changed your feelings about that experience. Schleiermacher wants to add that feeling is not religion in itself. Religion is not just any feeling, nor is it all feelings are religious. As Boston tells us, religion is more than a feeling. Religions are the reflections of specific feelings, while feelings are religious. There must also be an original activity or a knowledge or an act that the feeling is based upon. For Schleiermacher, the feeling must be of an object which is outside of the self, unlike James, who said it might be within yourself. And religion is therefore this Gefühl, or the feeling of utter dependence or absolute dependence. Unlike other feelings, this feeling requires the source to be outside of the individual and the individual to act as a result of that feeling. For Schleiermacher, it's important that it's something that's on the outside of you because it is your feelings which then draw you out of yourself, and that is where religious feeling exists for Schleiermacher. Not all scholars of religion look at religion as a function of society or of personal needs. In other words, not all scholars of religions are functionalists. As Bourdieu hinted at, there are structures also which set up how we function and what we take as granted. These structures help to delineate what a group is and also how that group is to act. Therefore, a certain aspect of what a religion is not just a function, but also a structure. Structures, by their very definitions, tell us who is inside and who is outside. It says this is what we do, and if you're not a part of that group, you're on the outside. You can't come in. You're excluded. Or this is the only people who are doing it. Why? Because that's the purpose of that organization. Structures give us purpose and also even how we should live as well as a sort of aspect of that. For instance, if you decide to get together with some friends and have a book club, you will end up thinking of a location that will be conducive for you to sit and discuss whatever the book happens to be. You'll have certain times that you will say, all right, we're going to meet regularly for this hour or 2 hours or once a month or whatever it happens to be. If instead somebody proposes that you meet at a club for book club, it probably won't fulfill the function of a book club. The noise, the lights, the sound will probably change radically the idea of, hey, we're trying to discuss this book. The noise and everything else will kind of take away that ability. It wouldn't be conducive for it. So even in the idea of we're meeting for a book club, you're excluding certain venues. You're excluding certain times. You're probably not all going to get up at 3 a.m. to go discuss the book either. It's going to be a time when everyone's schedule would line up and doesn't conflict with work or sleep or other basic functions. If somebody was to propose a sort of hybrid and a split between the difference of a books and beer club, that might be fine. That might be great. That might be conducive for your group. But it also might not. Structures also include a hierarchy that will determine if any of these things, like a book and beer club or a meeting at a specific time or location, will work. There are a lot of key structures that are a part of society. Groups of people that look at structures instead of a function of society are broadly identified as structuralists. There are also hybrids between these two and a bunch of other groups of scholars who kind of fall into different camps or take a little bit out of these different camps. But for a structuralist, there's typically three key structures that are talked about that help define what a society is. The first is language. Right? What's the difference between bat, cat, hat, fat, and sat? Just a tiny little sound. The ending is identical at the beginning, at the end, but the beginning is very different. And that little difference at the beginning changes the meaning of what's going to be expressed. If you were to read a story and somebody says they got so angry at somebody they threw their hat at them, that's a certain sort of notion in a picture that you understand. If, on the other hand, they said they threw a cat at them, that changes what that meaning would be. Now, the sound is very, very little, but what that sound signifies and how we're going to express that makes a big difference. If somebody said they threw a sat at somebody, it would be a non sequitur. It wouldn't make sense. And again, it's just one little difference of sound. So language makes a big difference. If you're reading a novel or an instruction manual and it's not in your language, you're going to have a hard time. You're not going to understand. And by the very nature of that language not being in your primary language, you are excluded from those who understand it. And somebody will need to then come in and do some work of translation. They're going to take it from whatever language it was in and bring it into your language. Now, all translation, by its very nature, has a certain amount of interpretation that's going to be presented. Words don't all exist with a one-to-one correlation, as anyone who's studied a foreign language knows. You start to change one word, well, it could mean this, that, or the other, depending on the setting, or it means this really strongly, but it kind of means this mildly, or, oh no, the way this is set up, it's clearly a joke, and if you're translating it and you don't know that, it might go over your head. So really the only way to break down that structure is to learn the language of another group. But by doing so, you're picking up the culture and the norms. You're understanding why something might be funny. You're understanding something about their history. So language itself is one of these massive structural components. Another one is kinship. Who do you marry? Who are you allowed to marry? Whose family, once you're married, are you a part of? Whose family do the children belong to? Right? These are questions that every society navigates. There are some society that, right, we propose the idea you're going to go off and you're going to get married, and the two of you are now your own new family unit. The children belong to you. They don't belong to one side of the family or the other. Right? The names that are being used and picked are divided up within all of these as well. Who is the most important man in a young adolescent male's life? Is it the father? Or is it the mother's brother, because it is a matrilineal society, at which point the father is outside of the family unit? Again, this is not how our society moves and operates, but it is how some do. And therefore, the relations and the jobs and the expectations and obligations between members of the family vary and they look different. And again, for the outsider, we take certain things for granted that are not universal. Also, what foods do you eat? This is the third of the major sort of structures. And we might think of this as a little less significant, but what foods you eat tell you a lot, right? Are there certain foods that you can eat all of the time? Are there certain foods that you can only eat certain times of the year? Are there special meals that come out at certain days? Are there also certain foods that are completely off limits? Do you eat chicken? How about beef? How about pork? How about dogs? Different societies eat all of these animals. And yet, for us, we in America generally don't eat dogs and cats, and rabbits are even a little tricky, right? because we have domesticated animals, and therefore we have some animals that we put in this, no, it's domesticated and therefore it's not okay to eat thing. And then we have other animals that we say, oh no, we raise you pretty much only to eat you. And then we have things like people have domesticated pigs, and we, all right, well, what do you do with them? Are you going to eat them later? What's the purpose? Is it just a pet? And we have this sort of ambivalence idea there. And it's not just an issue of domestication, because there are animals that are domesticated that people do eat. How many people have chickens now in their backyard that are kind of there? And oftentimes they're not just there for eggs, but might be eaten as well. Are there foods which we are just absolutely forbidden to eat? Different places around the world, different cultures are absolutely not going to eat pork or beef. And yet a bacon wrapped filet is completely common for us, right? Also, are there times of the year where you don't eat some foods? Right? Are there specific prescribed fasting periods? Right? Within the West, where there's a tradition of Lent, or traditionally within Christianity, you wouldn't eat meat on Wednesdays and Fridays. Then, about 1,000 years ago, in the West, the Wednesdays got dropped out, and then after Vatican II, the Fridays kind of got a little squishy, as it were, as far as what these prescribed periods of fasting or abstinence from this. How many of you ate a whole turkey over the summer? Right? This isn't necessarily something prescribed with any sort of religious significance, but for most of you, you're not going to get a whole turkey and have it at any other time other than Thanksgiving. That's when we do it. Can it be done at another time? Yeah, they're at stores. You can get them, many of which can come frozen and you can keep throughout the whole year. You can have a big kickoff to the school year. Memorial Day, you're going to have a whole turkey, but we don't do that. We have hot dogs, right? We have different foods that we have at different times. And that doesn't make sense for an outsider, but makes tremendous sense to those who are inside the group, because it's just what is done. It's built into this structure and fabric of society. And therefore, anyone who wants to do something different puts themselves on the outside of that group. It's as much as odd as somebody who says, yes, let's go to the dance club for our book club. It just doesn't seem to fit. It doesn't seem cohesive. Now, there might, again, be a nice little hybrid or something you can learn. This is one of the values of mixing and understanding different cultures, because you might learn something from another one and go, you know what, I like that tradition. I'm going to borrow it. We're going to incorporate that. We're going to internalize that because it might just work better. It might be more beautiful. But we have to bring that into our structure and reinterpret it just as we would reinterpret a foreign language. One of the biggest names in structuralism is Claude Lévi-Strauss. For him, it's all about the structure. He'll ask also, in addition to our questions about food and kinship and language, about how societies replicate themselves. And one of the ways this is done is the relation of myth. And so we need to figure out what's the difference between a myth and just any other story. All stories, he says, are potential myths, but to become a myth, they have to be accepted by the collective. They have to be accepted by society. They have to resonate with a group larger than just a couple of individuals. This is the difference between a story that you might have with a couple of your friends that doesn't necessarily resonate with a larger group. The audience of a story, if it's rather limited, it wouldn't become a myth, right? They just don't get it. It doesn't have this same sort of meaning, maybe because they weren't there, maybe they don't know the people, maybe the people aren't significant enough, at least for the larger group of people, right? Those that do, we all know about because they've resonated, they've become a part of our culture. We all know Superman. We all know where he's from. We all know his family's backstory. We all know what his mission is. We all know what his superpowers are. Right? These are things that we all are familiar with. In fact, we can even play with the myth because we know the myth so well. We can change his setting. We can change what his mission is. We can change what some of his powers are. And all of a sudden, by doing so, the story has a different significance. It has a different sort of meaning. And we can learn because of the familiarity we have. And this can only be done if the story has raised itself to the level of a myth. If we have some other figure who does the same thing but doesn't have that mythic connection, it just kind of falls flat. So myths kind of serve a purpose in helping us understand who we are and how we are to relate to the outside world. This is what Levi-Strauss tells us that a myth does, right? Myths, he tells us, don't really tell us anything about the order of the world or the nature of reality or of mankind. It doesn't matter if the myth comes from pop culture or if it's revealed in scriptures. For him, it still doesn't tell us about reality, right? Genesis might give us different layers of meaning, but it's only because it resonates with us, with our society. They tell us about the culture and what is important for that culture. This is what myths do. It's not about what's being said, but what that being said means to those who are saying it, and therefore the work that can be done as a result of that. They tell us what is important, and they tell us what ideas and ideals people have and want replicated. That is what's important for a myth, and that's why they resonate for multiple generations. Myths are about replicating and speaking to society. They are an essential aspect of the structure and are used to either reinforce that structure or explain what that structure is. Myths are unique but also interrelated. For instance, one important American myth begins with an orphan raised on a farm by their aunt and uncle. The farm is familiar, but it is also a certain amount, by its nature, wilderness. It's domesticated wilderness, but it's not rooted in society. It's somewhat on the periphery of urban or city or the center, right? The orphan yearns to leave, but that freedom is always somewhere over the horizon. It's elusive. They can't get there, even though that's where they want to go. Disaster then forces them to flee their home before they were supposed to. And eventually they're guided by an older, powerful sage, and they must then undergo a long journey, but don't do so alone. Along this journey, they end up taking with them 4 companions, including a metal man, a hairy man, and a small pet. The wise sage sets them up on their way, but doesn't travel with them. This is something that they largely are kind of doing on their own. Once they get to their destination, they realize that they had the power that they needed inside themselves all along. They then overcome their chief opponent, only to return, but now with a new perspective on themselves and with what their society is and their point in that. So, what story did I just say? It's one that's very familiar and you all know it. And some of you are probably shouting right now, it's The Wizard of Oz. Others of you might be saying, no, it's Star Wars. The answer is, it's both. They are the same story. Some of the details change, some of the specifics, but the basic arc of what the story is the same. Right? Myths also change, though, because once they have been written, they no longer belong to the author. They now belong to the people. They belong to that society. So the author might intend some grandiose purpose with their story, but once it moves from their story to a myth, it can change because what it's saying is something different. For instance, The Wizard of Oz was intended as a polemic to get the United States off of the gold standard. Dorothy is the everyman. The Scarecrow is the agricultural worker. The Tin Man is the industrial worker. The Cowardly Lion is William Jennings Bryan. The Wizard is the President of the United States. Looks like he's got a lot of power, but really doesn't. They follow the Yellow Brick Road, which is a little bit on the nose because that's gold. And the new danger is in the West because there's no more gold in the East, but there is in the West. And therefore, the center is the North and South fleeing from the East and being dragged through the wealth found in the West. Now, most of you aren't going to watch Wizard of Oz or Star Wars for that matter and think of economic policy and what that means. Instead, it has a different sort of meaning about overcoming and power and forces within ourselves that kind of speak to the American experience in a way that then also gets replicated in different countries throughout the world. Different cultures take it on because it resonates to some extent with them as well. And then, as franchises grow, meanings and everything else kind of also might move and adapt and change once again. Since myths are about aesthetics, they are also found in music. Music is really another form of myth, following what Levi-Strauss is telling us. He says myths move from person to person just as music is received from person to person. Not all sounds are music, just like not all stories are myths, but they must be received as music. It has to have the ear for a certain group of people for it to work. Levi-Strauss holds that this is true, that myths must even die to make way for a modern reception of music, that the myth is going away and something new within the 20th and 21st centuries is taking its place within music. We might see a return of myth actually as people are looking for deeper meaning, but music and myth kind of operate in overlapping but distinct groups as far as what speaks to them and tells them about who their cultural identity is. Music is just like art in this way. Great pieces of art were once religious for centuries, but with the death of religion, following what Levi-Strauss is saying, art is now no longer sacred, but beautiful representations of society. Music is mythical, and it speaks to a people and is valued and criticized not simply as a matter of taste, but of group identity and social identity. Music critics and generational differences of music, old and young, religious, secular, all exist within identifying who you are and what counts in one way or the other. Since music is replacing religion, music takes the source and authority of religion. There are those who have the right to perform it and those who are guardians that allow someone to listen, but not others as well. Right? We've had different discussions of, well, this is this group's music, and therefore you can't perform that, you can't say that, or you need to get permission, or this is working class music and you're now too wealthy, so maybe it's going to resonate with the working class. Maybe you are not allowed to play it because it seems fake when it comes from you. And this is a problem of sometimes of musical acts who start off at a very, speaking to a small group of people, and their audience continues to grow, and people now label them as sellouts for doing what they were doing before, but now with a lot more money, because it resonated with a larger or maybe a different audience as well. For this reason, he says, music evokes the same response as religion. Music allows for cultural myths to be passed on even when stories cannot be. Right? Different ways of survivals can be found within music for generations without even knowing why or how that's going to connect. I have a few different clips attached as well, and I want you to be able to go and listen to those and kind of think about the moods that are expressed within music. Different groups they'll resonate much more with, but the sound itself kind of moves you and elevates you to do something, even if you don't know what the story is or what the composer was thinking when they wrote it. It kind of moves you to a certain extent. There's certain times and places that we listen to certain music. Maybe it's only supposed to be listened to at a wedding or a funeral or with a romantic engagement. And you have different people or different settings, the music doesn't fit. It becomes, to a certain extent, comedic because it doesn't fit within that setting. Other times, something by moving it from one setting to another has a bigger and greater importance as well. Music can express things in a way that a myth does, and it becomes sort of visceral instead of just illustrated. So Levi-Strauss, in summary, says that structuralism reveals to a certain extent a paradox. It is structure that dictates man and not vice versa. The meaning of structure is also contained in the system itself. Mythology is a huge topic, but all aspects can be boiled down into binary choices for Levi-Strauss. For him, the fact that it is binary is very important. Something can either be so or not so. It is either A or not A. It is either A or B. The structure dictates what these options are, and the role you play is within this binary relation. Levi-Strauss reveals the core of structuralism when he says, man is not free to choose whether to be or not to be, a mental effort consubstantial with his history, and which will cease only with his disappearance from the stage of the universe, compels him to accept the two self-evident and contradictory truths, which through their clash set his thought in motion, and to neutralize their opposition, generate an unlimited series of other binary distinctions, which, while never resolving the primary contradiction, echo and perpetuate it on an ever smaller scale. It is structure that dictates everything for Levi-Strauss within society. Myths have a value because they resonate with the pre-existing structure. Sometimes they obviously reinforce society. Other times they clash with it, but they all are always a product of the existing structures. This struggle is always a binary one, but through this struggle, the structure grows and perpetuates itself in all aspects of life. So, in reflection, what I want you to do is recall a myth, a story, and a song. Pick one of each of these. Go ahead and write it down on a scrap piece of paper, or open up a document, and just kind of put these down. That way you can kind of think about it and look at it. And then reflect on why it resonates with you. What is the value? What is it that's being done? Is it the words? Is it the setting? Is it the place that you heard it? Is it with the people that you heard it with? Is it something that you see reinforces a small group or a large group? What is one also that's never made sense to you? And if it hasn't made sense, why doesn't it make sense? Is there a reason that other people like to constantly retell this story and you just go, I don't get it? Is it, what does that say about your place and your role within that group to which that story is so important?